Well, every year on Boxing Day, there is a sailing race called the Sydney to Hobart. Some of you will be familiar with it. And on Boxing Day, what happens is usually there's about an hour of TV coverage as the starting gun goes for the Sydney to Hobart, and the sailboats start to sail out to Sydney Head, and then usually get out from the heads and head their way down through into Hobart. And it's a pretty big event, pretty big race. This year, some years they go for records, and the conditions are perfect, and they make it in really good time. Some years it's a bit more of a slog. Some years it can actually be a really challenging ocean. And this year was one of those years. So over a third of the fleet that started had to withdraw because of the hard conditions, because of things being broken on the boats and not being able to continue. Back in 1998, there was another Sydney to Hobart that was even worse in terms of weather and even worse in terms of what ended up happening to the fleet. Again, a big chunk of the fleet had to retire. But this one was because there was such violent storms that it actually made the news. And in fact, you would see images on the news of massive 50, 60-foot waves, swell, and helicopters trying to rescue people in the water out of their boats with damaged boats and needing to be rescued. If you're trying to get a picture of that, 50 feet, I'm nearly 6 feet tall. So imagine 8 of me stacked on top of each other, and then you're hitting 50 feet. That's how high this swell of these waves were. And imagine what it would be like to be on a sailing boat in the ocean, where you're at the top of the crest of one of these waves and about to plunge down the face of the wave. Pretty scary stuff coming from that height. Almost like driving a truck off a 50-foot cliff and hoping you survive okay. It was pretty full on. And so back in 1998, we were reminded that the ocean can be a pretty scary and a pretty powerful place. That was just in the Sydney to Hobart. And even for the most experienced sailors, it was pretty full on. Last week, in Jonah chapter 1, we saw that Jonah was disobedient to God, which led to him running away from God. And he ran away from God by jumping on a ship, on a sailing or a boat, and trying to get away from what God wanted him to be doing, what God's plan was for him. There's a big storm that blows up around this ship. The sailors draw lots. They try to work out what the problem and issue is. Turns out it's Jonah. So the end result, Jonah gets thrown over into the water. And Jonah being thrown over into the water, it's not like today, I'm in a life jacket, I'll just hang out till the helicopter comes and rescues me. Or there's no, pull the pin and that auto-inflatable life-saving raft pops out, and, the orange one or the yellow one, and it's floating around, and I've got some rations there tucked away for emergency that I can chew on until someone comes to rescue me. None of that for Jonah. Jonah being thrown overboard was literally a death sentence. That was the end. It was over. His life was done. That was going to be the end result of Jonah being thrown overboard. And yet, God does something quite miraculous, really. And we see that right at the very end of Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. It says, right at the very end of the chapter, it says, "Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Jonah is saved in a miraculous and in a very unusual and unexpected way. Now, Jonah is a challenging book to preach on because all of you gathered here tonight are familiar with the story. And some of you may be going, heard the Jonah story before. Okay, I can switch off now and think about what YouTube clips I'm going to be watching tonight when I get home, or whatever the young people do today. And that's the challenge, isn't it? With a passage like this, a passage that we're so familiar with, all of us have heard the story probably dozens of times. The broader society and culture we live in refers to it on a regular basis. Jonah and the Whales. I even heard of a band once that was named Jonah and the Whalers, And so the story is so well populated that sometimes it's hard for us to actually take on board what we need to take on board. And that's certainly my prayer for tonight, that God will be challenging all of us about this story, and particularly this chapter 2 of the book of Jonah. And I think this passage, chapter 2, works for us on 3 levels. The first level is that we experience Jonah's testimony, him sharing his story of what God has done for him in extraordinary and hopeless circumstance. So we learn about Jonah, and we learn about God's generosity to him in terms of what God does ultimately to rescue him. So that's the first thing. We experience Jonah's testimony. The second thing that I think Jonah chapter 2 helps us to do is helps us to reflect on our own experiences of hardship, of challenge, of being in a dark place, and the importance of looking to God in those difficult experiences and situations for help, for support, for salvation. And the third thing that it does, which as does many of the Old Testament passages, but it points us to Jesus, how he suffered and how he's our ultimate salvation. So Jonah's testimony, our own experiences of hardship, and how we are pointed to Jesus. So let's have a look at this first section of Jonah chapter 2, and in particular, the first part of the passage I want to look at is the idea that Jonah ends up in a pretty dark place. And we see right from verse 2, Jonah, as he prays to God, as he cries out, he says, "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me." From deep in, and look at the words, in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You helped me into the depths, the very heart of the seas. The currents swirled about me. See, the chaos of the sea is hard for him to fathom, or your waves and breakers, they sweep over me. I've been banished from your sight. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains, I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. It's a hopeless picture, isn't it? It's a picture where there is no hope. It is a dark place that Jonah is in. He's in distress. He's deep in the realm of the dead. He's hurled into the depths, a dark and unsafe place that he lands, banished from God's sight, gone to his death. And I think that most of us can identify to differing degrees with what it's like to be in a dark place, in a difficult place, in an uncomfortable and challenging place. And there's a lot of things that can take us there, and it may even be a combination of a number of things that get us into that place. Stress at work, illness of a family member, death of a family member, shame from past actions, things that you've done wrong by others or wrong by God, broken relationships, even the stress of a global pandemic can take us to a dark and unsafe place. That's where Jonah was. He was in a dark and unsafe place. I talk with people most weeks who are experiencing difficult things. That's one of the things I end up doing through a normal week. Jonah lives this experience. He is in this dark place. So when he's stuck in this dark place, where does Jonah go? Well, it's helpful, isn't it? Even from the very first part of the passage. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. I've been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. To the roots of the mountains I sank down, the earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, my Lord, my God, brought my life up from the pit. And ultimately in verse 9, but with shouts of grateful praise will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. So you can see in the midst of this dark place, in this dark time, in this difficult circumstance, where does Jonah go? Jonah goes to God. And he commits himself to God. It's like he engages with God, and as he knows that God is his only hope, he says, Lord, if you do save me, this is what I will do. I will respond to you. If that salvation comes from you, I will tell others about that. And that was the ultimate task that he was called to do, to go to the town of Nineveh, wasn't it? To go to Nineveh and share the good news with that city. He commits himself to God. And the response to salvation from God is to commit himself to God, to sacrifice to God, and to follow through on that commitment to God. The experience for Jonah is a life-changing experience. He's reminded that only God can save him from that dark place, from the fish, from certain death in the ocean. There's no other option. There's no other plan that can come through. It is only God. And the appropriate response to salvation from God, once he's saved, again, thankfulness, commitment, and obedience. Has anybody heard of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean? Yep, a few people. Anybody know how deep it is? Yep, guesses? 11 kilometres. That's about what they talk about, 11 k's. Anybody know how long it is? Yep. Try 2,500 k's long. Anybody know how wide it is? 69 kilometres wide at the widest points. If Mount Everest was placed in the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, it would still be covered in 2 kilometres of water. That's how deep this trench is. At the bottom of the trench, the water pressure is over 1,000 times the standard atmospheric pressure at sea level. Pretty crazy, isn't it? It's a pretty big ocean. It's in the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. Now, I'm not saying that Jonah was floating in a fish above the Mariana Trench. I'm using that as an illustration to say that the ocean is a pretty big, a pretty powerful, and pretty scary place, or it can be. So, what do we take away, or what can we take away from the passage so far? Well, firstly, let's reflect on Jonah. What did Jonah do? Firstly, he runs away from God. He ends up in a dark place. He calls to God. He was saved, and he responds. He responds with thankfulness, with commitment, and with obedience. And we know that he wasn't perfect ultimately, and we saw that in the chapter 1, and we'll see that actually a little bit later in chapter 4. But he acted in response to the salvation that was given to God. So what can you learn from that testimony of Jonah? What can you take away from that? So what might be an application for us? Well, there will be times in our lives where things get a little dark. We can look to God for salvation. We can look to the light of the world, and we need to respond to God's love and grace with thanksgiving, with faithfulness, with obedience, like Jonah did. And I wonder if there is something that God is calling you to do. Is there something that he's calling you to do for him? And if so, how are you responding to that call? Thirdly, Jesus. There's many things in this passage, indeed in the book of Jonah, that do point us forward to Jesus. We see, interestingly, Jonah in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And did you pick up in our passage from Matthew where it refers back to Jonah and talks about and reminds us that Jesus, after his death, he would be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Jesus endures this for us. Jesus is the salvation that comes from the Lord. He's the embodiment of God's love, of God's grace and of God's intimate interest and care for you? Are you receiving and trusting in Jesus? Are you secure in your salvation? And I think that's one of the things I like about Jonah. See, in the most hopeless and impossible situation, when all is lost, Jonah prays to God and God saves him. And it doesn't matter what's going on in our lives, no matter what situation arises, we can look to God, we can pray to him, and we can find hope and peace and salvation in Jesus. And it's not just a rescue from a dangerous situation like Jonah happened for Jonah, but it's actually a rescue for eternity. It's a rescue and a reconnection with the God who loves us and makes us. And then I like the very last part of the passage, chapter 2. It's quite graphic. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. It is a graphic image. You see the fish there, maybe a bit of fish mucus being coughed up as Jonah lands, probably bleached a bit after 3 days in the acid of the stomach of the fish, and he ends up back on dry land. A few years ago, I travelled overseas with my dad. We went to Scotland. We did a bit of family history hunting, travelled around a few places. And I experienced something that, for me at the time, was quite new, and that was car ferries. I don't know if you've experienced that. Some of you may have been to Tasmania and jumped on the car ferry where you drive your car on the ferry, travel across to Tasmania and offload and keep going. Matt, have you done that? Yeah, Matt's done that. Has anybody else done that? The car? Well, quite a few people. Great. And it was interesting because there's a lot of islands off the western side of Scotland. The only way to get there is by these car ferries, and they vary in size. We went on one of the ferries we went on in Scotland was really took dozens of cars and could take trucks and other things. It was really the only way to get supplies and so on, and quite normal just to catch the ferry across so you could then drive around that particular island. We were crossing to the Isle of Mull. Crossing itself wasn't that long, wasn't a very long trip. But it was interesting that every time you go on one of these ferries, the night before you have to check the weather reports, and then early that day you got to check the weather reports. And the reason you got to check the weather reports is you don't know whether or not they're going to let you cross. Because if the weather is not good, if the weather is bad, the ferries don't run. You can't say, oh, no, I think I really need to get across there, let's just go. Like, it just doesn't work that way. And part of the reason is because of the power of the ocean. If the swell is too big, even though we have these massive machines that we've created to conquer the ocean, they still dwarf in terms of the power of God's creation. It's interesting, isn't it? God's creation is vastly more powerful than our ability to control it. Whether it's the Sydney to Hobart in 1998, whether it's ferries in Scotland in 2019, or whether it's an ancient ship with a recalcitrant prophet named Jonah a few thousand years ago. See, the God we serve is the King of this creation. He's powerful and he's loving, and in Jesus is the source of salvation. Let me pray. Lord God, we thank you for the book of Jonah. We thank you for the experience of Jonah. We thank you for the way that's captured for us. And I pray for all of us here tonight, Lord, that you would really speak to us very personally, very intimately, very specifically about the things in our lives that we need to hand over to you, the things in our lives that we need to trust you for, the things that we need to be obedient to you as we recognise the salvation that you have given us in Jesus. And not only that, Lord, make us passionate, Lord, about sharing that good news with others. And don't let us be fooled into thinking that others don't need to hear or experience your love through Jesus. And I pray this, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.